good morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is about the U.S. Africa Summit hosted by Uncle Joe, President Joe Biden. President Joe Biden invited 49 African heads of state to a U.S. African Summit. The last U.S. African Summit was held by former President Barack Hussein Obama. And to me, that summit pretty much was just about promises, and at the end of the day, I don't know what came out of it, But this summit being organized by the current president, Joe Biden, hopefully will bear some fruits. Will bear some fruits in terms of helping Africa in its economic, political, and democratic processes, and hopefully it will also change the dynamics of American-African relationships. But anyway, first of all, let me give a big shout out to Messi and the Argentina national football team for their victory against another great national football team, which is the French football national team, over the World Cup match, which to me is one of the greatest World Cup matches ever. This World Cup match to me is the greatest I've ever witnessed or watched. And I guess a lot of people will also say the same about this World Cup match. At the end of the day, Argentina won the game, but France also won because both teams came to play and both teams did very well. Very, very well. It was a marvelous game, and thumbs up to Argentina for coming out victorious. Now, let me dive straight into the topic or the subject of the day. The U.S. Africa Summit, which was held last week, was basically to promote America's standings with African countries. At the backdrop of the recent infrastructure and socioeconomic development by China. Even though the American government will say that this is not about China, but we all know, if you follow American politics and, around the world and American politics locally, you will know that basically this summit was about China. The elephant in the room on this summit was China, and to some lesser extent, maybe Russia. In the course of this summit, the U.S. government promised to give Africa about $55 billion in the next 3 years. And out of that $55 billion, most of it will go towards infrastructure, socioeconomic development, and democratic processes in most African countries. And out of this money, also, the United States government is going to support Africa in terms of security when it comes to the terrorism situation in some of these African countries and all of that stuff. But there was one thing that really caught my eye about this U.S. Africa Summit, which is the pledge of the $55 billion and how this money can be utilized so that the African governments and the African citizens will end up benefiting from most of these $55 billion that the U.S. government has pledged to allocate within the next 3 years. As an American citizen and also as a taxpayer of the United States of America, I'm tired of American government sending money to some of these corrupt African governments or corrupt governments around the world in the name of aid. Let me clarify my statement when I'm talking about that. I have no problem American government sending aid to African countries or any other country. But I have a problem when this aid ends up in the hands of bad governments, corrupt, fraudulent, and undemocratic governments all over the world, especially when it comes to Africa. That is where I have a problem with. And as a taxpayer of the United States of America, And I don't think any American taxpayer wants to see their money being squandered by corrupt governments in any country. So I strongly believe that a lot of Americans will stand with me on this issue. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because a lot of projects, a lot of pledges, a lot of money have been donated, gone to African governments, and because of the level of corruption, some of these money have never benefited the very people that this money is supposed to go and benefit and help develop their countries. Some of this money have been corrupted, have been stolen by these corrupt governments in the name of developing these countries. But at the end of the day, because of the corrupt and crony capitalism that most of these countries practice today, it ends up in the cronies, businesses, and family businesses of the political leaders of these African countries. So most of the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this money don't end up benefiting from them. But there's one thing I will say that really worked very well about 10, 15 years ago, when America also had the democratic project, where countries that were practicing democracies and as well as had good human rights cases, with no human rights abuses and all that stuff, and have transitioned from democratic government to democratic government and to democratic government and stuff. American government at that time under George Bush offered a lot of projects, built a lot of projects for these countries. And in that case, most of these projects were controlled by the US government. So basically what the countries will do is, whichever country wins that award, that democratic project award, the US government goes to that country, and that country will show what kind of project that needs to be done, which is going to be funded, 100% funded by the US government. So the US government will supervise in terms of the bidding process, the contractors, and everything. And at the end of the day, the money comes directly from the US government to these countries, the project directors or the companies that were awarded these projects. So at the end of the day, the money does not go through these governments in Africa. It goes straight to the contractor or the company that was awarded the bid for that project. And in some of these cases, most of these projects were done 100% efficiently, effectively, without any delays. Whereas when projects go to these African governments, the money goes to these African governments, some of these projects will be sitting down for years because of the level of corruption in these African countries. So if Joe Biden, the president of the United States, is pledging $55 billion, I hope they take the playbook from George Bush era, when a case in point was the N1 built in Ghana, as well as the European Union link road that joins the N1. Both projects were financed. One was financed by the US government and the other by the European Union, were directly financed through the US government and went straight to the contractor. So it had nothing to do with the Ghanaian government. And out of that, these projects were built within 2 years, 3 years, with no problems. So if President Biden is offering or is pledging 55 billion taxpayers' money of America to Africa, it's a very good welcome news. But at the end of the day, we hope this money will go straight to the projects and not go through the governments of these various African countries. Because at the end of the day, when these monies goes through these governments, these corrupt governments in Africa, I'm sorry, most of these people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of these infrastructure projects will have to wait so long before, even if these projects will ever be completed. Because this is nothing new. You go to a lot of African countries and you see a lot of these projects that were pledged by these donor countries, and you witness what is going on and you see exactly what I'm talking about. So I hope this time around, President Biden's pledge of $55 billion will go through the same channel that the George Bush era democratic project went through, so that the money comes straight from the US government and straight to the contractors or the companies that will be awarded these bids, and will be supervised by the US appointed consultancy or whatever, just like around George Bush era. And I think that is the best way for these $55 billion that the United States government is pledging will be put in a good use for all of Africa. Now, he also talked about helping the African countries, basically expanding inviting African countries to join the G20 as well as the UN Security Council. I don't know if the UN Security Council will be expanded to include African countries. It's been talked about. China will welcome it, and I think Russia will welcome it. So hopefully, I don't know which African country will get opportunity to be on the UN Security Council, but I think most likely it might be either Nigeria or Egypt or South Africa. I mean, most likely I think it should be Nigeria in terms of population-wise. With the economy, they're the biggest economy in Africa anyway. So I think most likely Nigeria will be the one country to be considered if that thing is going to bear any fruit. But with regards to the G20, which is the economic summit, also most definitely I think it's going to be Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt. One of those, basically those three countries anyway. But all those are symbolisms anyway, because what Africa really needs, to me, it's not about symbolism and all that stuff anymore. Africa needs foreign direct investment. That is what Africa needs: foreign direct investment, FDI. Basically, foreign companies from these developed countries having access to African markets and investing in African economies. I think that is the key to Africa's economic independence. I've said that before, and I'll continue to say it. The only solution to Africa's economic problems, is going to be private foreign direct investments. That is it, and nothing else. It's not going to come out of handouts, grants, or donor countries giving aid to this and that and all that stuff. All that is well and good. Donor countries can help in terms of infrastructure development, pipe-borne water projects, electrical grid projects, help with those things. That's good. But when it comes to lifting Africa out of its economic woes, the only way and the only solution to that is foreign direct investment. So that is where President Biden also talked about with the African leaders. Then there comes the Somalia president. I mean, I think he had a very good thing to say about his point in terms of what Africa needs, because he basically hit on the nail when it comes to Africa's economic development. He basically also talked about the private foreign investment, all that stuff. And that was a very smart move on his part. But the most important thing that really caught my eye also with regards to this summit was the fact that some of these countries that were invited by the United States government to this summit shouldn't have been invited by President Joe Biden. And why am I saying this? Now, I'm a strong believer in a democratic process, in democracy. I believe in freedom. And I believe in countries having self-determination as well as giving their people their rights. Rights to choose their leaders and self-governance and all of that. But when you look at some of these countries, and if you look at their system of governance in some of these countries, talking about a country like Gabon, talking about a country like Central African Republic, Tunisia, Zimbabwe, and if you look at the path of these so-called democracies that they have in these countries, I don't think some of these leaders that attended this summit deserve to be at that table. I'm sorry. I get it. Some people will say, oh, China is, coming to Africa. China doesn't look at human rights, democratic process and all that stuff. And China is building roads and infrastructures and all that stuff. I get all of that. But people have to understand also that there's a big difference between China and the United States of America. China, as we all know, is not a democratic country. China is basically like a dictatorship. Okay, it's still a communist country, but practices more of a capitalist form of economy. By the end of the day, its political structure is basically a communist country. So I get it. China doesn't give a damn whether you are a democratic country, your human rights, what do you call it? You have human rights issues, and when it comes to in terms of your treating, how you treat your citizens and all that stuff. I get all of that. But when you talk about the United States of America, the United States of America is the fundamental to the foundation of the democratic processes, the democratic systems that we live in today in this world. America is the beacon of democracy. That is what it is. America is not like any other country on this planet, period. America is the beacon of the democratic system that we live in around the world today. So America is the only country that can stand up and fight for the democracies of every country on earth. And America should do so and call out countries that have had bad democratic processes, bad political structures, bad political systems, and bad what do you call it, human rights record and all that stuff. America is the only country that can stand up and show it. So the fact that China is in Africa doing infrastructure projects and all that stuff does not mean that America should not call out leaders or should not invite leaders who are practicing undemocratic form of governance in their various African countries. So I understand. I get it when people talk about China, all that stuff. But America is an exception. In America, we have what they call the American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism is what former great US President Ronald Reagan said. It's totally different from the rest of the world. No country is like America when it comes to that. They are the beacon, they are the foundation of that democratic process that we all enjoy. So they have the right, and they should use that to try to convince these countries, and Africa in particular, that are very undemocratic with high records of human rights abuses and all that stuff. America should be able to stand up against that. Now, there's also one particular incident that also caught my eye with regards to this summit, especially it was a video that came out. And in this video, it was the opening remarks by the president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, where he talked about Africa doesn't need to be going around begging for money and having other powers in Africa's business, economics, and social, political, business, and all of that stuff. And it made a lot of sense when you hear a leader from Africa stand up and with those firm words against the so-called powers of the world, which is America and European leader countries and all that stuff. But this same president, having said that in one of his opening remarks at the summit, turns around and have a private meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State, Blinken, where he basically snitches on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea, where he raises concern about the military coups that have happened in these three countries, which I get that. I'm staunchly against military coups. I understand the concerns of most African countries when it comes to military coups, especially when you have a democratic elected government in some of these countries. I get that. But it is not up to another president of any African country to basically invite America into the local politics of an African country. That is where I have a problem with that statement and that invitee, basically from the Ghanaian president to the US government. And basically, he was talking about how the Russian mercenaries are in Burkina Faso, and also the Burkina Faso prime minister going to Russia for about 10 days and all that stuff, which I don't really get it. I mean, at the end of the day, I understand the concerns of some of these African countries when it comes to military coups. I get that. But if the Burkinabes have accepted their military leaders, then that is up to the Burkinabes to make that determination, whether to accept it or not to accept it. It is not up to any African leader to snitch on another African country to the superpower like the United States, basically inviting the United States into the African politics of stance in terms of pitching African countries who are aligned with Russia or with China against African countries who are aligned with United States and the West, creating basically the same old Cold War mentality or mindset in Africa. Africans don't need that. Yes, we don't want coups in Africa, but by the same token also, we don't want leaders who will snitch on other African leaders just because they disagree with them, thereby inviting some of our old colonial masters into African politics. I mean, I thought Africans are independent now. I thought we have been independent for about 50, 60 years now. If we have issues on our continent, it is up to we African leaders to talk about our issues and find solutions to our issues. But it is not up to any African leader to go and basically invite the superpower like the United States to come and be part of the African economic or political situation in any African country. So I was very disappointed. I was very disappointed when I saw that video clip on the part of the Ghanaian president. But I hope they can make amends with the Burkinabes and the Malians and the Guinea presidents. Because at the end of the day, we Africans don't have to be fighting among ourselves over what kind of governance or what kind of democratic system we want. Every country goes through its own problems. And if these people are going through the military coup now, yes, we might disagree with them. But at the end of the day, we should not be inviting any foreign country into our local politics in Africa, period. So I'm very, very disappointed with that statement made by the Ghanaian president at that table with the U.S. Secretary of State. But anyway, if I'm going to end this subject today, it's going to be on the fact that hopefully this summit will bear some fruit for the African people. If it's Sunday, if it's the Africa Weekly Talk, God bless you guys and enjoy your week.